Hi everyone, this is Casey, and welcome to House Lorebridge. Today, I wanted to get into another A Song of Ice and Fire character whose identity is uncertain in the books. This character appears in A Storm of Swords and A Dance with Dragons, and we never find out, so far, his true name or what his importance may be to the end of the story. I'm talking about Coldhands. But first, before we get into who I personally think are the best two candidates for his true identity, let's refresh our memories. Coldhands is the character who helps Sam and Gilly escape from the Whites and get south of the Wall in A Storm of Swords. And in A Storm of Swords and A Dance with Dragons, he helps Bran and his friends get north of the Wall to the Three-Eyed Crow. Now we don't know his true name, and he gets the name Coldhands from Sam and Gilly. In the show Game of Thrones, Coldhands is presented as being Benjen Stark, the brother of Ned Stark and former First Ranger of the Night's Watch. Also in the show, he isn't around to help get Bran and his friends to the Three-Eyed Crow's cave, but he is there to help get Bran and Mira back to the Wall after they leave the cave. He also, in the show, saves Jon Snow from the Whites after he falls in the frozen lake in Season 7. Now, it remains to be seen if either of these events will play out the same way in the books. However, George R. R. Martin has said that no, Benjen Stark is not the true identity of Coldhands in the series. Although this was a note made on an early manuscript, I think it's pretty safe to rely on this information because Martin is pretty well known for not giving many straightforward answers to questions about the series. Before we get into who I think Coldhands might be, let's go over the facts that we know about him pretty much for sure. First of all, we know that he's dead, and he has been for a while. As such, he cannot go anywhere that is protected from the dead by magic. We also know that he has dark eyes, not blue like the Whites. In fact, his eyes are the only part of his face that aren't covered. We know that his hands are black, hard, and cold. Hence the nickname. He explains to Bran that this happens when blood settles in the appendages after death. We know that he has a murder of ravens that follow him, and Bran sometimes thinks that they appear to communicate with him. We also know that he rides a huge elk. And lastly, we know that he's able to speak in a language that's unknown to Bran. I think this could possibly be the language of the First Men, which is often heard beyond the Wall. Now, there are also a handful of things that we can speculate about Coldhands. For example, we can guess that he's a former brother of the Night's Watch. His clothing is all black, he calls Sam brother, and he even knew the secrets of the Black Gate at the Night Fort and was able to tell Sam how to open it using his Night's Watch vows. He also appears to be acquainted with the Three-Eyed Crow and the Children of the Forest. Leaf, one of the Children of the Forest, also informs Bran that the Whites cannot kill Coldhands because they killed him long ago. Now Leaf is somewhere around 200 years old, so I think we can pretty safely guess that he's been dead for at least that long. Also, Coldhands seems to appear to have some Stark loyalty, at one point even being referred to as Bran's monster. Now there's a handful of characters who some people think could be Coldhands, but here are a few that I don't think are possible. The first is Bloodraven, but Bloodraven's the Three-Eyed Crow. Also, it's been speculated that Coldhands could have been a member of the Raven's Teeth, who were a group of men who went to the Wall with Bloodraven. But I don't really like that one much either, just because Coldhands and the Three-Eyed Crow seem to be acquaintances at best. Now the last three are all characters from our main storyline, so I think that rules them out instantly because they haven't been dead very long. For example, both Waymar Royce and Will were killed in the prologue of A Game of Thrones, and Squire Dalbridge was killed by wildlings, not Whites, when he was ranging with Jon and Corn Halfhand. Now, here are the best two candidates that I think there are for who he could really be. The first is the Night's King. The Night's King was the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, who supposedly married an other and was performing dark magic and making human sacrifices. The Night's King was brought down by Joramun, the king beyond the wall, and the King of Winter, Bran the Breaker, who also happened to be the Night's King's brother. Now, we could think this because of the Night Fort. The Night Fort was the seat of the Night's King, so his intimate knowledge of the castle that not even a bookworm like Sam had is interesting. The Night Fort is also where the story of the Rat Cook takes place. This story is supposed to teach a lesson in the vengeance of the old gods against those who don't obey their rules. If the Night King is Coldhands, it could be a punishment for his marriage to an other and naming himself king and her his queen, which all of this was forsaking his Night's Watch vows. Also, Bran's thoughts on the appearance of the Black Gate when Sam leads him to meet Coldhands are pretty interesting. Bran thinks, if a man could live for 1,000 years and never die, just grow old, he might come to look like that. Then, Bran and his friends go out the Black Gate and meet Coldhands, who just happens to be hiding most of his face. Now, some evidence that I think there is against the Night King is that the Night's King has been, presumably dead, since the Age of Heroes. Now, on a Wiki of Ice and Fire, it states that the Age of Hero lasted somewhere from 10,000 to between 8,000 and 6,000 before Aegon's conquests. So this would make Coldhands between 10,000 and 6,000 years old, or years dead. Even if he is a magically reanimated corpse being kept alive by the maliciousness of the old gods, I would think that we could expect him to be a bit more decomposed than he is. When Bran wargs into summer, he thinks that he can smell the dead and rotten Coldhands, and Bran and his friends have also noticed that Coldhands doesn't appear to breathe or eat, but otherwise he seems to be in pretty good shape for a dead guy. Also, I personally feel like the Night's King is a bit too obvious for George R.R. Martin. On Westeros.org in June of 2015, Martin says that the Night's King is a legendary figure, like Lan the Clever or Bran the Builder, and he's as likely to have survived to the present day as they are. And finally, if there's any truth to the story of the Night's King, he was likely completely destroyed and burned after his defeat for consorting with the others. Now, the second candidate that I think could be Coldhands is Brandon Snow, who is the bastard brother of Torrhen Stark. About 300 years before our main storyline, Brandon Snow wanted the King of Winter, Torrhen Stark, to fight Aegon the Conqueror and his forces, who were then in the Riverlands. Brandon Snow even talked about sneaking into their camp and killing them, and went so far as to volunteer himself for the job. But, in the end, Torrhen Stark opted to make peace with Aegon, and from then on was known as the King Who Knelt. Afterwards, some of the disgruntled Northerners went to Essos and formed a sellsword company known as the Company of the Rose. Now, given that Brandon Snow was all for attempting to retain Northern independence against Aegon, I think it's pretty safe to guess that he wasn't very happy with Torrhen's decision. However, Brandon isn't named among those who went to Essos. Now, I think this means that he didn't go with them. I feel like if he was important enough to be named at this point in history, he would have been important enough to point out if he went to Essos. Now, the North, and in particular the Starks, have a long history of supporting the Night's Watch. And what do bastards and brothers with no family purpose do? They join the Night's Watch. Now, in my mind, this would have been appealing to Brandon Snow, because the politics of Westeros don't come to the Wall, so he would still be free from Targaryen rule. Also, if we fast forward a few hundred years after Aegon's conquest into our main storyline, we see Bran in a cave with the three-eyed crow. In his dreams in the cave, one person Bran sees in Winterfell's Godswood is a dark-eyed youth, pale and fierce, and this youth had sliced 3 branches from the weirwood tree and was shaping them into arrows. I think that these arrows were being carved specifically for either the Targaryens or their dragons while they were in the Riverlands. If this is the case, weirwood arrows would actually be pretty good, since weirwood is a very durable material for weapons, but it would also make a symbolic point, as a lot of houses north of the neck at this time followed the old gods. Now, in these visions that Bran is having in the cave, he seems to be seeing back through the ages of Winterfell's Godswood. For example, he first sees a younger Ned Stark, and then a little farther back, he sees children playing, which turn out to be Lyanna and her siblings. And then he sees this youth, he sees a human sacrifice, and a couple of other things. This youth's description and his placement back through the history in Bran's dreams make it seem as though he could likely be Brandon Snow. I mean, Martin doesn't usually show us things like this that are irrelevant. So the relevance of Brandon Snow in this vision could be his new identity as Coldhands. Now, some evidence against this is that Brandon Snow, while he's noted historically, it's very, very briefly. Also, we have to ask why Brandon Snow in particular would be chosen to be Coldhands. Could it just be because he has the blood of the first men in his veins? The main evidence against Brandon Snow being Coldhands is just the lack of solid evidence. But what does everyone think? Who do you think Coldhands could be? And do you think that it could be any of the characters named above? Thanks for watching. See you next time.